Ontario Premier Doug Ford rejected President Trump's threat to charge Canada for wildfire smoke crossing into the United States, calling the criticism absolutely unacceptable. Reuters, The Hill, The New York Times, and Politico all describe a dispute that moved from weather emergency into trade politics after smoke from Canadian fires reached U.S. cities. The practical background is that firefighting decisions sit with provinces, federal agencies, and emergency managers, not tariffs. Reuters says Ford pushed back directly, The Hill says he framed the attack as unfair, and The New York Times says Trump connected smoke to possible tariffs. Politico's account keeps the focus on how a cross-border environmental problem became another pressure point in U.S.-Canada relations. The consequence is that residents still need evacuation notices, air quality alerts, and damage counts while leaders argue over blame. Watch next for Ontario emergency updates, Canadian federal wildfire briefings, U.S. air quality readings, and any written tariff notice that turns the threat into policy. Those records will show whether this remains political theater or becomes a concrete trade measure tied to a worsening fire season. A second checkpoint is whether Canadian and U.S. agencies coordinate air monitoring publicly, because shared measurements would make the tariff argument easier to test against the emergency record, and the key record is a dated emergency bulletin, because that ties political blame to verified fire conditions. Wildfire smoke over the United States is easing in parts of the Northeast, while unhealthy air remains a problem for parts of the Midwest. NPR News, NPR, CBS News, and CNN describe a shifting smoke map rather than a single national all-clear. The useful context is that wind patterns can improve one region while pushing fine particle pollution into another. NPR's coverage says air quality is improving in the Northeast. CBS points viewers to maps and alerts, and CNN tracks the smoke forecast as public health guidance changes by location. For families, schools, outdoor workers, and event organizers, the consequence is practical. Exposure guidance depends on local sensors, not a national headline. The Midwest risk also connects back to the Canadian fire season, because new fire growth or wind changes can quickly alter readings. Watch next for Air Now readings, state health advisories, school or event decisions, and Canadian fire updates that change the plume forecast. Those records will show where masks, indoor activity, or outdoor schedule changes are still warranted today. The important distinction is geographic. One city can improve while another deteriorates, so the next official sensor map matters more than a broad regional label, and the key record is the next state or federal health advisory, because that tells communities which precautions are active. Local readings and health department alerts are the operational record now. Taylor Farms expanded an iceberg lettuce recall to 27 states after a cyclospora outbreak raised food safety concerns. CNBC Top, The New York Times, PBS, and The Guardian all identify lettuce shipments and public health monitoring as the center of the story. The background is that cyclospora infections can take time to confirm, so recall boundaries often change as investigators match illnesses, products, and distribution records. CNBC names Taylor Farms in the 27-state scope, The New York Times describes the expanded recall, and PBS reports the cyclospora risk for shipped lettuce. The Guardian's coverage adds another public account for consumers trying to decide whether a package in the refrigerator is affected. The consequence is immediate for grocers, restaurants, and households because recalled lettuce should be removed rather than washed and used. Watch next for FDA or CDC notices, lot codes, retailer lists, updated illness counts, and any Taylor Farms statement narrowing which products are involved. Those records will show whether the recall stays contained or widens as more distribution data comes in. Consumers should compare package dates, brand notices, and retailer recall pages, because a state list alone does not always identify every affected store shelf, and the key record is an FDA or company lot code update, because it tells consumers exactly which lettuce to remove. Retailer notices and product codes are the operational record now. An ICE officer linked to a fatal shooting in Maine had described cognitive deficits after a 2021 head injury, according to records cited in the coverage. CNN, AP News, The New York Times, and The Guardian all place the officer's history inside a broader review of the shooting and prior behavior. The background is that a fatal law enforcement encounter turns on both the immediate use of force facts and the personnel record behind the officer. CNN focuses on the head injury claim, AP News reports family and record details about violent behavior, and The New York Times cites the officer's defense of the shooting. The Guardian adds outside scrutiny as investigators and agencies face questions about supervision, training, and discipline. The consequence is that the case is no longer only about one moment in Maine. It also tests whether warning signs were documented and acted on before the encounter. Watch next for investigative findings, ICE personnel statements, court filings, body camera or forensic releases, and any local prosecutor decision. Those records will show whether the shooting is treated as justified, criminal, or an agency oversight failure. The personnel file also matters because it can reveal whether supervisors had warning signs, medical information, or disciplinary records before the shooting occurred. And the key record is the investigative file, because it connects the shooting timeline with documented personnel warnings. Andrew and Tristan Tate were arrested in Miami, with the U.S. Marshals Service confirming the action to AP, according to multiple outlets. NPR News, Politico, CBS News, and ABC News all frame the case around international allegations and the brothers' movement through U.S. custody. The background is that arrests in the United States can connect to warrants, extradition requests, or domestic proceedings, and each path has different deadlines. NPR News cites the Marshals Service confirmation, Politico identifies the social media influencers, and CBS describes rape and trafficking charges tied to the United Kingdom. ABC coverage gives another mainstream account separating confirmed law enforcement action from online reaction. The consequence is that the next legal record matters more than the celebrity profile, because custody status determines where the case moves. Watch next for a federal docket entry, extradition paperwork, bond or detention orders, and statements from prosecutors or defense lawyers. Those records will show whether the Miami arrest leads to transfer, a contested hearing, or a separate U.S. legal process. The brothers' public following raises attention, but the legal checkpoint is narrower. Which court has custody, which charges are live, and what transfer request exists, and the key record is the custody docket, because it separates celebrity attention from charges, warrants, and transfer deadlines. Court filings and warrant papers are the operational record now. Trump blamed Canada for wildfire smoke spreading into the United States and said he would add a pollution cost to tariffs. Reuters, CNBC Top, South China Morning Post, and the Straits Times all describe the same political move against the backdrop of active Canadian fires and U.S. air quality problems. The background is that smoke crosses borders through weather systems, while tariffs require a written trade action or agency process. Reuters reports Trump's blame of Canada, CNBC frames the tariff cost threat, and South China Morning Post describes the link he drew between smoke and trade pressure. The Straits Times gives an additional international account of how the statement is being read outside North America. The consequence is that businesses and governments need to know whether the comment becomes enforceable policy or remains a negotiating threat. Watch next for U.S. trade notices, Canadian federal responses, provincial wildfire briefings, air quality readings near major events, and any tariff language that names a pollution surcharge. Those records will decide whether this becomes a legal trade dispute layered on top of an emergency response. The trade angle also matters for companies exposed to cross-border costs, because written tariff language would be the first sign that the threat has operational force, and the key record is any written trade notice, because only that would turn a smoke complaint into tariff exposure. Victims in the Epstein case criticized Todd Blanche after a meeting tied to his attorney general nomination fight. CNBC Top, PBS, Hawaii Tribune-Herald, and the Economic Times all describe the meeting as part of a confirmation pressure story rather than a closed legal resolution. The background is that survivor meetings can shape Senate votes, public accountability demands, and the written record around a nominee's past role or promised actions. CNBC reports the victim's criticism. PBS says Blanche met accusers after a demand from a Republican senator, and Hawaii Tribune-Herald tracks the survivor meeting after Tilly's pressed for it. The Economic Times adds another account of the political stakes surrounding the nomination. The consequence is that the meeting can determine whether senators demand commitments, documents, or follow-up testimony before moving forward. Watch next for statements from survivors, Senator Tom Tillis, the Judiciary Committee, and Blanche's team, plus any new hearing schedule or written answers. Those records will show whether the criticism changes votes or remains a public warning attached to the nomination. The survivor response matters because confirmation fights often turn on whether senators view a private meeting as accountability or as an inadequate substitute for public answers. And the key record is committee follow-up, because senators can demand public answers after the private survivor meeting. Committee records and survivor statements are the operational record now. The United States carried out new strikes on Iran after 2 service members were killed, and one was reported missing in an attack on a Jordan base. Reuters, The Washington Post, CBS News, and NPR all describe a military escalation with casualty reporting and search information still central to the record. The background is that deaths, a missing person search, and retaliatory strikes can widen a regional conflict if officials do not define objectives and limits clearly. Reuters reports renewed U.S. strikes. The Washington Post ties them to the Jordan base attack, and CBS says the military reported 2 killed and 1 missing. NPR's coverage gives another public account of the response and the uncertainty around what comes next. The consequence is immediate for U.S. forces, regional governments, and civilians near possible targets, because each strike can produce further retaliation. Watch next for Pentagon casualty updates, missing person status, base security reviews, Iranian statements, allied briefings, and congressional reactions. Those records will show whether the operation is a limited response or the start of a broader cycle. Congressional notification also matters because lawmakers can demand the legal basis, casualty timeline, target list, and exit strategy behind any continued military action. And the key record is the Pentagon timeline, because it will show casualties, targets, legal basis, and next military limits. A landslide in southwest China's Chongqing has killed at least 8 people and left 34 missing, according to the latest reports in the package. Reuters, AP News, PBS, and Al Jazeera all identify Pengshui County as the affected area and put rescue operations at the center of the story. The background is that landslide casualty numbers often change as crews reach buried homes, damaged roads, and unstable hillsides. Reuters reports the death toll and missing count, AP News names Chongqing's Pengshui County, and PBS repeats the scale of the disaster for a U.S. audience. Al Jazeera adds regional context as emergency officials work through weather and terrain risks. The consequence is local but urgent. Families need rescue updates, shelters, road closures, and confirmation that surrounding slopes are safe. Watch next for county emergency management statements, revised missing person counts, rainfall data, infrastructure inspections, and any provincial relief order. Those records will show whether the disaster stabilizes or whether additional slides and access problems raise the toll. Rescue timing is critical because unstable ground, blocked roads, and weather can determine whether missing person numbers fall through recoveries or rise through new reports. And the key record is the emergency count, because it will show whether rescue work is finding survivors or confirming losses. County rescue logs and provincial relief orders are the operational record now. Israeli strikes in Gaza killed Palestinians, including children, according to health officials and regional reporting. WAFA agency, the Los Angeles Times, Al Jazeera, and the Times of Israel all describe a deadly day in Gaza while differing in emphasis and casualty totals. The background is that wartime casualty reports require careful attribution because hospitals, local officials, militaries, and international agencies may update numbers at different times. WAFA reports deaths including a child in Gaza City. The Los Angeles Times says 9 Palestinians were killed including 3 children, and Al Jazeera reports additional deaths around funeral mourners. The Times of Israel provides another regional account for comparison with Israeli official statements. The consequence is humanitarian and diplomatic pressure. Civilian deaths shape ceasefire demands, aid access, and arguments over military targeting. Watch next for hospital updates, Israeli military statements, aid agency reports, funeral and field accounts, and any ceasefire or hostage negotiation response. Those records will show whether the casualty count changes and whether the strikes alter diplomatic pressure today. The immediate record to compare is casualty reporting, military explanation, and aid access, because each one shapes how governments describe proportionality and civilian risk, and the key record is the next verified field update, because it will separate initial casualty claims from revised official totals. Hospital reports and military statements are the operational record now.